In 1987, two of the strongest alpinists in the world disappeared on this ridge. Last seen moving well, no distress signal, no wreckage. The mountains simply closed around them. Their bodies weren't recovered for 13 years. They weren't beginners. They weren't unprepared. Nobody could explain what went wrong. This is Hummingbird Ridge on Mount Logan, and somewhere on this ridge, something happens that most mountains don't do. The terrain shifts beneath the decision you already made, and by the time you feel it, there's nothing left to reverse. What is it about this ridge that swallows climbers whole and gives back almost nothing? The answer starts with the shape of the mountain itself. The ridge rises from the Seward Glacier in Canada's St. Elias Range as a knife-edge arête, a blade of rock and ice that climbs nearly 12,000 feet over 6 miles of exposed terrain before reaching the summit plateau of Mount Logan. At 5,959 meters, Logan is Canada's highest peak, and it is still rising, pushed upward by tectonic uplift at approximately 0.35 millimeters per year. The mountain is, in a literal sense, still building itself. On both sides of the ridge, the slope drops close to vertical. There are sections where the ridge narrows so severely that a climber is essentially walking a tightrope between two different kinds of fall. But the geometry alone doesn't explain the commitment. What makes Hummingbird Ridge different is what happens at key sections of the rock when you try to reverse direction. On a standard technical route, a difficult section can usually be repelled. You fix an anchor, thread your rope, and descend the same terrain you climbed. The terrain is steep, but the physics work in your favor. On Hummingbird Ridge, that math doesn't hold. The character of the rock at certain sections makes anchors unreliable. The angle and the exposure combine in ways that make rappelling not just difficult, but more dangerous than continuing upward. So, forward progress and retreat carry roughly equal time and risk past a certain point on the lower ridge. And then, deeper in, retreat stops being a real option at all. The window where you can still turn back closes behind you as you climb. Most climbers don't notice the exact moment it shuts. The route's name comes from a moment during the 1965 expedition. A hummingbird hovered over a climber's red pack at the base of a feature called the Prow, the prominent rock buttress that guards the lower ridge. The team noted it and the name stuck. A small, weightless bird clinging to the air above one of the most committing pieces of terrain in North America. 5 climbers have died on this ridge, not in a single catastrophic event, not in one famous storm. In the slow accumulation of commitment pushed past the point of recovery. That pattern matters because it tells you something specific about how Hummingbird Ridge works. It doesn't ambush you. It doesn't collapse without warning. It simply requires that every decision you make going in is correct, because the terrain won't let you unmake them. Most mountains offer second chances. This one doesn't offer many, and it doesn't advertise which chance was your last. To understand what that commitment actually costs, go back to 1965, and the team that first proved the ridge could be climbed at all. There is a photograph from that expedition taken from the glacier looking up at the lower ridge. What looks like shadow in the lower third of the frame isn't shadow. It's a 3,000-foot vertical drop into a cloud bank. That is what Dick Long and Alan Steck were standing above before they had fixed a single rope. Dick Long and Alan Steck had already built serious reputations in American alpinism before they ever set foot on the Seward Glacier. Long was a technical climber with a methodical mind and a record on big walls. Steck had been pushing hard routes in the Sierra Nevada and beyond for nearly 2 decades. In 1965, they assembled a team of 6 and turned their attention to a ridge that had never been attempted. Nobody had tried Hummingbird Ridge because nobody had been certain a human being could survive it long enough to find out. They didn't go light, they went deliberate. The team used a siege approach, the same strategy that defined high-altitude expeditions of that era. Fix ropes on the hard sections, establish camps, move supplies up in stages, retreat to lower camps when the weather turned, and push again when it cleared. The idea was to spread the commitment across time, to climb the ridge in pieces, rather than absorbing its full demand in a single push. It took 35 days. Day 4, winds too high to move. Day 11, ropes finally fixed on the prow. Day 18, 2 climbers show early signs of frostbite. Day 22, rations thinning, the summit still not visible from their camp. Day 29, a storm pins the entire team on the knife edge for 36 hours. The mountain didn't break. The men held. That number tells you something the grade and the elevation don't. 35 days on a knife-edge arete means 35 days of managing the exposure, the weather, the fatigue, and the slow erosion of certainty that comes from living in terrain where a single poor anchor or a single mistimed step ends the expedition permanently. The St. Elias Range doesn't moderate its conditions for acclimatization schedules. Storms build fast off the Pacific and hit the range with full force. The ridge sits high enough that there's no shelter from what the atmosphere sends. The knife-edge sections were exactly what the ridge's geometry promised. There were places where the team moved one at a time, with the other climbers anchored and watching, because the ridge was simply too narrow for any other approach. The technical difficulty wasn't concentrated in one crux. It was distributed across miles of terrain where the margin for error stayed thin from the glacier to the summit plateau. And yet the point of no return didn't arrive as a single moment. It accumulated. With each camp established deeper into the route, with each rope fixed on terrain that couldn't easily be reversed, the option to abandon the attempt grew more expensive. Not impossible, not immediately, but more costly. The decision to push forward each day was also, quietly, a decision to make going back harder. By the time the team reached the upper ridge, the arithmetic had already settled. They weren't choosing between summit and retreat anymore. They were choosing between summit and a retreat that carried most of the danger of continuing with none of the resolution. They reached the summit. All 6 climbers came home. The first ascent of Hummingbird Ridge went into the record as one of the most committing first ascents in North American mountaineering history. Not because of its altitude, not because of a single dramatic moment, because of what it required to stay on the ridge long enough to finish it. The 1965 team set the template. Hummingbird Ridge rewards total commitment and punishes hesitation. The question it left open was, what would happen when 2 of the best alpinists in the world came back and tried to do it faster? By 1987, the gear had changed. Gore-Tex had replaced canvas, lighter alloys had replaced wood and steel, protection systems had improved, forecasting tools had improved. The climbers coming to the ridge in 1987 were better equipped by almost every measurable standard than the team that had stood on the same glacier 22 years earlier. None of that changed the ridge's arithmetic. The terrain doesn't weigh your gear. It measures your commitment against its own geometry, and the geometry hadn't moved. 22 years passed between the first ascent and the second attempt. In that time, Hummingbird Ridge sat largely untouched. The 1965 team had proved it was possible. Nobody had proved it was repeatable. By 1987, David Cheeseman and Catherine Freer were among the strongest alpinists operating anywhere in the world. Cheeseman had built his reputation entirely on technical routes in the Canadian Rockies, including a new route on the north face of Mount Goodsir and the north pillar of North Twin with Barry Blanchard, routes that pushed Canadian alpinism into a new category. He had attempted Everest and K2 the year before. Freer had matched him step for step, with hard routes across the Rockies and a climbing resume that put her in a small category of alpinists capable of operating at the absolute edge of what the mountains allow. Together, they were a team with the technical skill and the psychological makeup that Hummingbird Ridge seemed to demand. They didn't go with a siege. They went light and fast, alpine style, the approach that had been transforming high-altitude mountaineering through the 1970s and 1980s. No fixed ropes, no established camps to fall back to. Move quickly enough that the mountain doesn't have time to find you in a bad position. The logic is sound on many routes. The speed itself becomes a form of safety. You're through the dangerous terrain before the weather window closes, before your reserves run down, before fatigue starts compressing your margin. On Hummingbird Ridge, that logic met the ridge's specific arithmetic. They were last seen high on the route, on a 900-meter knife-edge section called the Shovel Traverse at approximately 13,500 feet, moving well. That detail matters because it rules out an early error, a miscalculation on the lower sections, a mistake before the full commitment of the upper ridge. They were deep in the terrain, past any realistic point of retreat, and by every visible measure, they were where they were supposed to be. Then they were gone. When wardens flew a supply drop after the pair went overdue, what they found at the Shovel Traverse was a small yellow tent hanging from an ice axe above a 1,525-meter drop, a large gap in the cornice beside it. no climbers. The most probable explanation is cornice failure, but no one was close enough to know. The ridge offers no witnesses and almost no forensic record. In the spring of 2000, 13 years later, Parks Canada wardens on an aerial patrol spotted a body on a section of the ridge just 0.6 meters wide, with 1,200-meter cliffs on both sides. No helicopter could land. Recovery was impossible. The body remains there. At least 5 people have died on this ridge, and the mountain has returned almost none of them. What the 1987 disappearance adds to the record isn't just tragedy. It adds a specific dimension to what commitment on Hummingbird Ridge actually means. On a route where retreat stops being viable past a certain elevation, there is also no rescue. The terrain that prevents you from going back also prevents anyone from coming to find you. The margin that disappears behind you as you climb is the same margin that a rescue operation would need to reach you. When something goes wrong high on this ridge, the response time from the outside world is measured not in hours, but in years. And sometimes the answer that comes back is a body on a glacier a decade later. Cheeseman and Freer didn't make an obvious error. They were the right people with the right skills in the wrong arithmetic. 3 years later, 2 more climbers came back. They survived, but only just, and partly because of something left on the mountain 37 years before anyone needed it. Dave Nettle and Jeff Creighton came to Hummingbird Ridge in 1990 with a plan built around speed. Their route, which bypassed the shovel traverse entirely via a couloir and rejoined the original ridge at 14,000 feet, was called the Thunderbird Variation. 8 days. That was the target. 8 days to move through terrain that had taken the 1965 Team 35, through terrain that had swallowed Cheeseman and Freer without a trace. The logic was the same alpine-style logic that had driven mountaineering forward for 2 decades. Move fast enough and the mountain doesn't catch you. They moved fast. They completed the route in 8 days, which, measured against everything the ridge had shown about itself, was a remarkable execution. The technical climbing, the exposure, the knife-edge sections, the weather variability that defines the St. Elias Range, they got through all of it within their window. But the caloric arithmetic had failed them. The physical demand of Hummingbird Ridge doesn't announce itself in advance. The route looks like a calculation you can make from the glacier: distance over time, weight of food versus weight of gear, energy in and versus energy out. Nettle and Creighton ran that calculation and packed accordingly. What the ridge actually costs in calories is something the numbers don't fully capture until you're deep in the terrain, moving through sections that demand full technical concentration at altitude, burning through reserves faster than any spreadsheet predicted. By the time they were closing on the summit plateau, the food was gone. On most routes, running out of food at that stage is a serious problem. On Hummingbird Ridge, where turning back costs roughly the same as going forward and retreat through the upper sections was no longer viable, it was a potentially fatal one. They were committed to finishing. The finish was the only exit, and they had nothing left to fuel it. Consider the position they were in. Above 17,000 feet, 2 days of technical climbing still ahead, caloric reserves at 0. The body at that altitude is already operating at a deficit. Cognition slows, grip strength drops, decision-making under cold and hypoxia starts to fracture. The arithmetic says you cannot continue. The terrain says you cannot go back. There is no third option unless the mountain provides one. Then they found the cache, a food cache left by the 1953 Logan Cook expedition. 37 years earlier, still intact, still usable. 2 of the 3 tins were rancid. The third was packed with perfectly preserved food, kept by the cold for nearly 4 decades. The man who placed that cache was Dick Long, the same Dick Long who co-led the 1965 first ascent of the very ridge Nettle and Creighton were descending. Long had left it on his first trip to the St. Elias Range, 12 years before he would stand on the Hummingbird Ridge summit himself. He had no way of knowing that in 1990, 2 men would be standing at that location, with empty packs and a 13,000-foot descent still ahead of them. It kept Nettle and Creighton alive. That detail reframes everything that Hummingbird Ridge demands. Not just the technical skill, not just the speed, not just the physical conditioning or the psychological stability required to function for 8 days on terrain with no margin for error. All of that, executed nearly perfectly, still left them dependent on a decision made by people who had been dead for decades. The 1990 ascent wasn't a failure of planning. It was a near-perfect execution that still arrived at the absolute edge of what was survivable. The ridge absorbed their best effort and gave them back just enough. That is the arithmetic of Hummingbird Ridge. You can do almost everything right and still need the mountain to give you something you didn't bring. The pattern across 1965, 1987, and 1990 is the same. Hummingbird Ridge doesn't punish weakness. It punishes one specific assumption. The assumption that you can always change your mind. Cheesemond and Fritcher were the right people with the right skills. They moved well. They made no visible error. And the mountain absorbed them anyway, because past a certain point on that ridge, being competent isn't enough. You also have to be lucky. And luck is not a system. Nettle and Creighton were also the right people with the right skills. They executed nearly perfectly, and they still arrived at the absolute edge of what was survivable, dependent on food left by men who had been dead for decades. They didn't beat the ridge, they found a loophole. The ridge didn't offer it. A 37-year-old decision made by someone else did. That is the most dangerous thing you can bring to Hummingbird Ridge. Not a lack of gear, not a lack of experience. The assumption that the terrain will give you a second chance if you need one. It won't. The window closes behind you as you climb, and it closes quietly, without announcement. By the time most climbers feel it shut, the arithmetic has already settled. 5 people have died on this ridge, not in one storm, not in one catastrophic moment, in the slow, silent accumulation of commitment past the point of return. The mountain doesn't negotiate. It just waits for the assumption to arrive. If this breakdown changed how you think about commitment and risk in the mountains, subscribe to Summit X for more forensic analysis of the decisions that determine who comes home.